Today I'm going to show you, this is a project I'm working on for Christmas gifts. These are throw pillows, and they are made from neckties that belong to my grandfather, and he passed away several years ago. But recently at my grandmother's house we found a bunch of his neckties, and so I brought them home and I have cut them all up and I'm making these pillows out of them, and I'm going to show you how you can make these as well. So let's get started. Okay, so to make the size pillow that I'm making, I actually just figured up how many ties I had, how many of them I could match up and wanted to use per pillow, and then I figured up how many pillows I could make. I was trying to get the most pillows that I could made out of these. So what I'm doing in this project is using 3 different ties. So here I have the 3 that I'm going to put together in a pillow. And what we're going to do is we're going to start by cutting them up. So I'm going to put 2 of them to the side, and I'm going to start with 1 tie. And this is how you get started. We're going to line up our point over here on the wide end, and I'm going to use my straight edge, and I'm going to cut that point off the end so I have a nice straight edge here. And without moving my tie, since I know that's my starting mark here, I'm going to move over and cut this strip right here, 13 inches long. Okay, so we've cut this first strip, which we started from the wide end, and we've got a 13-inch piece. I'm cutting everything 13 inches, and then whatever the width winds up being when I get these all put together, that's just what size I cut my back piece to. But now that we've got that piece cut, we're going to move on to the rest of our tie. I get 3 strips of fabric out of 1 tie, and the way that I do that the most efficiently is once I cut my wide end, I flip it over and start with the narrow end, and I do the same thing, line it up and use the straight edge to cut my point off, and then I measure 13 inches, move down, make a cut, and I can do that a second time from this end of the fabric. So I'm going to pull it over and cut it at 13 inches as well. Okay, now you see I still have a section of fabric here, which is what I'm going to call the middle excuse me, of the tie. And the reason I'm cutting this way is so that I can discard this piece. And the reason I don't want to use this piece in my pillow is because there's too drastic of a change from one end to the other. This side is much wider than this side, and it's going to create a curve in the front of my pillow, and it's going to alter the overall shape of my pillow when I try to sew it with the straighter pieces. So I'm avoiding using these pieces. So I'm going to show you one more time on one more tie how we're going to cut, and again we're going to start by cutting off the point on our wide end, and I'm going to cut that piece at 13 inches. And then I'm going to flip my tie so that now I'm working from the point on the narrow end, and I'm going to again cut that point off so I have a straight edge, and then I'm going to come over at 13 inches, cut there, And then I'm going to make one more cut, pull that over, and so I have 13 inches here. Okay, I'm going to cut the last tie and then I'll see you right back here in just a minute. Okay, so I have all 3 of my ties cut for this pillow. You should have, as long as your tie is a fairly standard size necktie, you should have 3 pieces. That's what we're going to use anyway to make this particular pillow. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to arrange these pieces the way that I want my pattern to go and lay them out and make sure that they're all facing the right direction and that they're going to make the best shape that I can make with these, because they are not straight. Some parts are still narrower than other parts, so I want to make sure I'm putting them together the best way that I can. And I think with these, I usually like to pick out either the most elaborate tie or the most colorful tie and use it as the center. I'm going to look at, I think I'm going to try this one in the center. So then what I'm going to do is alternate the other 2 ties on either side. And that is going to start the center of our pillow. These 3 widest pieces are going to make up the center front of the pillow. And now we're going to determine where we're going to put the rest of our pieces to create a nice symmetrical-ish pattern. What I have been doing on the previous pillows that I have made is using the 2 strips from my centerpiece on either side of the center here so that I have a nice alternating pattern of those. That leaves me with the 2 pieces of my other 2 panels, and what I like to do with them is put them on the opposite side and put them together. So I'm going to have a wider strip here of this fabric, and then I'm going to have a wider strip here of this fabric. So we have a nice little pattern going on here, and I think that's what is looking best when using only 3 ties per pillow. Of course, if you wanted to make this bigger, square, there are many different ways you could do this, and you can lay them out any way that you want to. The only tip I will give you for sewing these together is, like I did right here, I have turned so that my wider end my wider ends are opposing. So if I have a wide end down here, then when you look at the top of these, then I have a narrow end here and 2 wide ends on either side. And what that's going to do is help keep these lines there. It's going to create a fairly rectangular shape instead of a wonky shape. If you were sewing them all in the same direction, you would wind up with kind of this diagonal shaped pillow that's going to look crooked when you go to put a back on it. So that's the only tip I'll give you, is to make sure you're alternating as best you can your wide ends and your narrow ends. So now we're going to put these together, and I'm going to explain to you really quick how I'm going to put these together on the sewing machine, and then I'm going to cut to me actually putting some of these pieces together. What I like to do is start on either end, it doesn't matter, and I'm going to, since I have these 2 on the end, I'm just going to flip. Everything's right side up right now. I've laid everything out right side up, so I'm going to flip my end piece over onto my next piece so I have right sides together on these 2, and I'm going to line them up as best I can so that my ends are going to be fairly level by the time I get done cutting. And you can use pens and pin these together. Pins and I have a love-hate relationship. Sometimes I can't sew without pins, and sometimes I choose not to use pins. I'm not using pins in this. I'm going to use my fingers at a really slow pace on the sewing machine to make sure that I keep them lined up very straight. But I'm not going to use pins. And then I'm going to stitch a very narrow stitch down the right side of these two pieces, so that then you will open them up and they will make one whole piece right there. And we're just going to keep adding section by section, stitching it down. And when I say a narrow stitch, I have my sewing needle all the way over to the right hand side, as far as it'll go on the right hand side in its position, and I am putting these through the sewing machine, you'll see in just a second, at the very edge of my presser foot. So I'm getting a very, very narrow edge. You do want to go slow at this and make sure that you are getting both pieces of tie when you're making your stitch. Otherwise, you might have some issues later on. But that is how we're going to put them together, and I'm going to jump over now and show you how I'm doing that on the sewing machine. Okay, so this is going to be the best angle that I can give to you guys. I'm lining up my pieces, and I have right sides together, and this is the side that I'm sewing down on the right side. I'm always going to sew down the right side, so I'm always going to pick up my pieces and put them in here and sew down the right side. I do have my needle all the way over to as far as it'll go to the right, and again I'm lining up these pieces as far as I can, just under the presser foot, just where the edge of the presser foot and my edge of my tie is lined up there, and then we're just gonna sew down.
So when you're putting both pieces of tie through here, you just want to make sure that you're putting equal tension on each piece of tie. Otherwise, one will become tied and the other not so much, and it'll make your project go crooked. So just make sure you're keeping an eye on that.
Okay, so there we have our first piece put together. And I will mention to you that I did not backstitch the top or bottom of this, and the reason being is because by the time I put my back on it, those seams are going to be sewn across anyway, and these are quite tricky to push. At least in my sewing machine, sometimes I have a hard time pushing the edge of these through my machine. It might be the way that I'm trying to sew them, and I may not be doing it the right way. I'm not an expert by any means, but I have trouble with that. So okay, now with careful attention to which end is your top and your bottom, however you've laid them out here, and make sure that you're always coming back to pick up another piece where the tops are where they're supposed to be and the bottoms are where they're supposed to be. So these are the two pieces I've just sewn together, and this is how they were laid out originally when I placed out my pieces in the pattern that I wanted them to be in. So what I'm going to do now is, if these are already put together, so I'm ready to flip them over on top of the next piece, which makes them right sides together. I'm going to line them up and I'm going to stitch down the right side.
So again here, just make sure that you're keeping equal tension on both pieces of tie so that you're not pulling one too tight and causing a crooked stitch.
Okay, so here I am after sewing that one on, and these will want to curl up on you, especially on the edges. I think that's why I like to start with these little end pieces, because they're annoying, and get them out of the way, but it's fixing to get easier. So this is the way they were laid out originally. We've sewn them together all the way, and now again I'm ready to I have them turned the right way with my top at the top and the bottom at the bottom, and now I'm ready to flip it over so that right sides are facing together, and then I'm going to sew it along the right hand side. Okay, so now we have one of our side middle sections now in our sewing, and you can continue along this pattern and just keep moving down and down and down. But like I said, these guys right here on the end are quite annoying, and when you're trying to put, if you go from one end to the other, by the time you get over here and try to put these two guys together, you've already got a piece that's yay big, and it's a little bit harder to work with. So what I like to do is when I get about halfway through, either with one of the middle pieces or two of the middle pieces put together, I'll start on this other end, and I will start working from this side and start with these two pieces together. And you can either do them opposite the way that you've been doing it, whereas you're going to start from your edge and flip it over, and you're going to sew down the left side. Then will be how you do that. You do need to remember to switch your sewing machine needle over to the other side and make sure that you're lining up the edge of your ties with the left hand side of your presser foot, or you can continue to do it the same direction you've been doing it. You just want to remember to always start with the piece on the right and flip it over the piece that's on the left, and then you'll sew down the right side here. And we're just going to put these pieces together starting from this end. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back with you. Okay, so now that we have our front stitched together, we are going to cut a back to fit. Like I said before, your ties are going to come in different widths. So by the time you get these sewn together, they're not all going to be the same size. So the best thing to do is just to get your fabric that you're going to use for the back side of your pillow and spread it out and lay this down on top of it, spreading it as much as you can and cutting a piece to fit. So I've already cut these to size. They're actually a little bit big. What you're going to want to do now, I would recommend with most fabrics that you pin at this point. That way you just get a nice stretched out, even coverage and straight lines. And it's going to, especially this Sherpa fabric is it's quite stretchy, and it's going to slip and slide and get crooked if you don't pin it. So
while you're pinning around your project, you just want to make sure that you're pulling your ties down flat, not too much. You don't want to put too much tension on here, and again, you'll create a weird stitch if you pull too tight with your backing, but you do want to make sure that they're laying flat, and because they're going to curl back up, they will cause your backing to wrinkle, but when you get it sewn together and get it stuffed, all of this will lay perfectly straight.
okay, so what I've done here is I have pinned 3 sides. I have decided which side I want to hand stitch on, and I typically have been choosing the busiest or the most patterned side, or one that you're not, if you do happen to see stitching when you go back and stitch up your stuffing hole, you want to try to conceal that best. So I thought this side would be best. So I have pinned all along these 3 sides that I'm going to stitch completely down, and on this last side I'm going to only sew so far in from each side, and I'm going to mark approximately where I'm going to sew to, and then I'm going to not sew a gap of 2 to 3 inches. You want it, you know, it depends on your preference. If you like hand stitching a lot, which I don't, you can leave it bigger and make it easier to stuff, or you can go smaller and struggle with stuffing your pillow, and then you don't have to hand sew as much when you're closing it up. So
here's where I'm showing you how the back is looking a little wrinkled. Again, this is because the ties have curled back up, even though I pulled them flat to pin them to the backing.
typically I like to sew with my ties up so I can make sure that I'm hitting where I need to hit and covering all my edges and getting a good seam in there. But this fabric does not like to slide through my sewing machine. So we have to do it backwards, another good reason for pinning, and hope that we hit the mark on all of our ties and we don't have to go back and do an extra stitch anywhere. So let's sew all these together and then we'll come back and stuff our pillow.
Remember to backstitch at the start of each of your sides so that all of your corners are backstitched in both directions. This side is not the cut edges of the ties, so I'm continuing to sew a very narrow seam allowance down this side. As you come to this corner, remember to backstitch in both directions, and when you turn to go down the cut edges of your side, you can sew a wider seam allowance. This way, 5/8 to 1/4 inch to make sure you're getting all of your ties sewn down. And don't forget to keep equal tension on both pieces of your pillow.
Got my fingers here on where I can feel the end of my tie. I should have just cut that excess off to start with, but I chose not to. I wanted to make sure I had enough, so I'm just gonna make sure I get here to the edge and do a little bit of backing up. I am going to find a hole here, and I'm just going to stick my finger in here along the seam and make sure that I can't stick my finger through anywhere, which would indicate that I've got a hole or a gap. I might find one later, but while I've got it inside out and I've just sewn it, now's the best time to fix it if I find it, and it looks pretty good right there. We are ready here to go down. This is the edge I just sewed, and now I'm going to make sure I get in here where I need to be. Make sure I'm covering my tie. Again, just like this side, you want to use as narrow of a stitch as you can. So I'm going to try to line that up and make sure that my tie is just to the right of my presser foot. And we're going to right here is the first pin that I've marked to where I'm going to sew to, and then I'm going to leave a gap between this pin and this pin so that I can stuff my pillow later. So when you get to your pin marker, you're going to want to do a little bit of back stitching here as well, just to kind of help hold this together while you're stuffing it. And now we are going to thick, man. Alright, so I am here at this marker, and I have made sure that I've got clearance on my tie. Pretty much the same. You want to kind of, sometimes this is hard to do, and I'm just kind of trying to judge how far I ran it up top so that my seam is as straight as I can possibly get it down here at the bottom. I'm going to start, and I'm going to do a little bit of back stitching.
Coming to the last side of your pillow, for me, this is also the cut side of my ties, so I am going to sew a wider seam allowance again all the way down this side.
And we have now sewn all 4 sides of our pillow. Right here is the hole that I left open in the front. And cut my strings off here. Again, I'm going to use this access hole. I'm going to stick my hand in here, and I'm going to apply pressure to my seams all the way around and make sure that I don't feel any places where I might have a hole that needs to be stitched, because right now is the best time to fix that if you're going to have that happen. Otherwise, you're going to be hand stitching it later, and if you're like me and you suck at hand stitching, it might not look all that pretty trying to fix a hole. I think it's good though. So I'm going to adjust the position of my camera because now we're ready to stuff, and I'll show you how I deal with my raw edges and my corners, and then we're going to turn this and stuff it. Okay, so here we are. We have the inside of our pillow is what we are currently looking at, and we're ready to trim up our seams, which should pretty much only be where you sewed the raw edges of your ties, because we've got a wider seam allowance here. So what I like to do, and again, this is one of those things that doesn't necessarily have to be perfect. You've got a little bit of forgiveness here. I'm just looking at my stitch down through here, and I'm placing my straight edge as straight as I can get it, but making sure that I'm not going to cut into my stitch. If you do that, you're going to have a big issue. So you want to just make sure that you can see your stitch line and that it's behind where you're going to cut. And I'm just going to get my rotary cutter here. You can leave as big an edge on this as you want. I just like to have a smaller seam allowance here. I think it makes for a nicer looking pillow, but if you cut it too short, you might wind up getting holes. So just find you a nice happy medium, maybe an 1/8 of an inch is a good place to be. And you just want to go through and trim off all that excess. And that was thick. And then we have a nice straight seam there. And I'm going to do the same thing over here to the other side.
You don't have to have a straight edge and a rotary cutter to do this. You can use scissors to cut off any excess and make a straight edge here past your seam.
You also don't have to do this next part. I find that I see a place here where I've missed a stitch, but I don't think it's going to be a big deal. Okay, that corner looks much better. Sorry that happened off camera. I didn't feel like moving it again. That corner did not look as good as I wanted it to. I was worried it might come apart. Now's the time to fix all that too before you turn everything inside out or right side out and stuff. So, corners. Some of my corners are wider than others. I just like to go in, and if you can see here, I've got some pretty bad lighting in here. If you can see right here, this is the stitch that I just fixed, and what I did is just right here where they meet in this corner, I did some back stitching just to secure that corner. Now I have from this point where my stitches meet all the way to this edge, and all you're going to want to do is cut straight across. Let's see if I can do it here where you can see it. I'm just going to cut straight across that corner and make it flat. And I'm going to repeat that on every corner that I have. Make sure you stay away from your stitches. Do not cut your stitches where they meet. See, here is a good example. One of my stitches here does go all the way to the edge, but where my stitches meet is further up here. So you don't want to cut where your stitches meet. And this is going to help your corners to turn and not be so bulky. Okay, so we have cut our corners and we're ready to turn. And what I like to do when I turn, I stick my hand in the hole and I start, and I try to push that corner out as much as possible. It's easier for me to do as much as I can now than to try to stick something up in there after I've turned it. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other bottom corner.
You're going to continue corner by corner, turning your pillow right side out through the hole that you've left to do so and to stuff. I like to go back into each of my corners and just make sure that they are turned out as far as they will go as I'm doing it.
Now we have a pillow with a front and a back. And now it's time to stuff the pillow. I'm stuffing my pillows with Poly-fil, fiber fill. It's easy to work with and it's working for me so far. So what you're going to want to do is just go ahead and get you a handful and start working it into that hole.
Handful by handful, I start at the bottom of the pillow and work my way all the way up to the top, making sure that I'm using my fingers to move the stuffing around and get it where I need it to go, and that I don't have lumps in my pillow, and I've got a pretty even fill all the way through. I'm trying to be conscious of how I want my pillows to look and keep in mind the integrity of the stitching of my pillows. So I am trying really hard just to get a nice even fill and not to overfill and put any additional stress on my stitches.
Now that feels pretty even, and I don't see any visible lumps on this side of my pillow, which is the side that you're going to need to worry about if you're working with something like this. It's fleecy or fuzzy. And I'm going to flip it over, and I've got some nice clean edges and nice looking fill here. We're going to go up through on the tie side, and I'm going to go just behind where I sewed a while ago, and myself. Just behind that seam. Now, before I pull this all the way through, I want to run my needle through my thread and create a little knot there that's not going to come out. Okay, and then before we start our ladder stitch, I'm going to jump over exactly across from where I'm at now and pick up a little bit of my fleece fabric, and I'm also going to put a knot in here by slipping my needle down through my thread. I hope I'm getting a good bit of this because I can't see what I'm doing and make sure that it's in frame as well. Okay, so now we've got it started. Now our needle is currently on the fleece side, so what we're going to want to do is jump straight across and start with, and I'm going to have to turn this around because I'm right-handed, not left-handed. I need to go the other way. So I'm going to start on my tie side. I'm going to go in and make as small of a stitch as I can, but these ties are so thick it's kind of hard to get a small stitch. But you can see here how wide my stitch is. Okay, that was going across. Uh-oh, I've got my thread through here. Don't want to do that. You want to make sure your thread is not looped. Boy, I really look like an amateur, don't I? Okay. Now, if you can tell where my needle is, you can see how far away from the edge of the tie that I am. This is going to give the seam allowance for the rest of this section that we're stitching up. And the idea is to also do the same thing on the fleece side. You want to put your stitches in line with where your fabric has already been stitched to. Otherwise, you're going to create some weird looking puckers in here. And the way that we are going to make our ladder stitch work is every time that we jump from side to side, you want to jump straight across. So I'm going to pull my fabric, or my thread over and see where I need to go down into my fleece, which is somewhere around this area. And I'm also going about 1/4 to an 1/8 of an inch, 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch back, trying to stay in line with what my seam allowance already was. And I'm making a little slip and then sort of tucking that fleece down in there before pulling my thread across and seeing where I need to put my next ladder.
You're going to continue jumping from side to side. Remember to go straight across and keep your stitches even. And you also want to remember that you're leaving that seam allowance when you enter your stitch into each side. This is going to help you close and create an even seam all the way down the side of the pillow. Every few inches, you want to pull those stitches tight so that it's not so hard to do when you reach the end of your stitching.
Pull tight, make sure I've got a nice that looked a little wonky, but I just stuck my finger in there and pushed the seam of the edge of the fleece back down in there. Okay, now I think I've pretty much closed this up. I am going to go back right here, kind of sort of in the ditch here of my seam. This is where my seam that I sewed with the sewing machine starts, and this is where I finished up. So I'm going to kind of overlap the two right here in this ditch, sort of, if I don't hurt myself. I really should have a thimble. Okay, and we're going to make a knot, and we're going to then go under that knot we just made. And go back through our thread and make another knot, and then we're going to go under that knot one more time. And make one last knot. And then I'm going to go right down through this pillow. Where did that go? There it is. Out the side, so I can pull my knot down into my ditch and snip. You have now finished a tie pillow made from neckties that you can use as Christmas gifts like I'm doing. So there you go. Easy peasy. Even a beginner can do it. It's not too hard. Doesn't take a whole lot of sewing skills. A lot of it for me was trial and error. I'm by no means a professional sewer, but my grandmother did teach me a bit about sewing, and I've taught myself a little bit more as I've gotten older. But I don't know all there is to know about sewing. So I will leave it at that. You can take my advice with a grain of salt, or you can follow my instructions to a T, and let me know down in the comments below if you made this pillow, how it turned out for you, and if you did anything different, or if you've got any ideas for how to make it different or help somebody else with it. You can also leave them in the comments below as well. So there we go. We finished this pillow. I'm making 10 of these to give to my family members for Christmas, so I'm gonna go finish working on those, and we will see you guys next time.